Story 1. The Haunting Hunt, a father's desperate run for survival in the wild. Tom Rivers was excited. After years of solo hunting trips, he was finally taking his 14-year-old daughter, Emily, on her first big adventure. They'd planned for weeks, stocking up on gear and talking through safety tips, hoping to make this a memorable experience. Deep in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, with nothing but the forest around them, it was meant to be the perfect escape. Just father and daughter, connecting with nature. But as dawn broke over the trees, Tom sensed something was off. The forest was unusually quiet, with even the birds and insects seemingly muted. The pair continued along the trail, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He shrugged it off, chalking it up to nerves about Emily's safety, and tried to refocus on their hunt. A few hours into their hike, they came upon a man standing just off the trail, partially hidden by trees. He was tall and unkempt, with clothes that looked like they'd been worn for weeks. His gaze was vacant, yet intense, as though he could see right through them. Tom felt a chill run down his spine, but he nodded politely, hoping to keep things civil. The stranger didn't respond. He just stared, his mouth curled into an eerie smile. Tom whispered to Emily to stay close and kept moving. But something about the man's presence felt wrong, almost predatory. As they continued, Tom noticed the man shadowing them at a distance, disappearing behind trees and then reappearing further along the trail. Every time Tom glanced back, there he was, closer than before, the unsettling grin still on his face. Then, as they rounded a bend in the trail, Tom's heart dropped. There, in the underbrush, was a human head, eyes wide open in terror, mouth frozen mid-scream. It looked recent, the features still discernible, the skin a sickly gray under the forest light. Emily gasped, clutching her father's arm as she stifled a scream. Tom knew they had to leave, and fast. Trying to stay calm, he whispered to Emily to follow his lead, moving back toward their car as quietly as possible. But before they could retreat, the man stepped out from behind a tree, blocking their path, his dark eyes gleaming with a twisted satisfaction. He tilted his head as if relishing their fear. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice low and chilling. Tom tightened his grip on his hunting knife, adrenaline surging as he shielded Emily behind him. He knew he couldn't risk a confrontation, not with his daughter at his side. "We're just passing through," he said, keeping his voice steady. But the man took a step forward, unfazed. In a sudden burst of courage, Tom grabbed Emily's hand and bolted, pulling her down the trail as fast as they could run. The sound of heavy footsteps crashed behind them, leaves and branches snapping as the stranger chased after them. Tom's mind raced with panic, every instinct focused on keeping Emily safe. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached their truck. Tom shoved Emily inside and leaped into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys in his trembling hands. The stranger appeared at the edge of the clearing, watching as they sped away. His twisted smile burned into Tom's memory. Even now, back home, Tom is haunted by the memory of that man and the lifeless eyes of the severed head they stumbled upon. What should have been a bonding trip became a nightmare they'll never forget. They never returned to those woods again. And to this day, Tom wonders how close they came to becoming the next victims of the wilderness. Story 2. The Dark Ritual. Friends' camping trip turns into a battle for survival. A camping trip was all it was supposed to be, an escape from city life, a weekend of peace and fresh air in the remote mountains of Oregon. Jacob Fields, along with his friends Mark and Sam, had packed their bags with everything they'd need: food, tents, fishing gear, and enough firewood for endless stories by the fire. But nothing could have prepared them for the horrors that lay hidden in the misty wilderness. On their first day, they trekked deep into the woods, far from any marked trails. They wanted isolation, a place where they could truly be alone. By evening, they found a spot near a glistening stream and quickly set up camp. The forest was quiet, and for a moment it felt like they'd found a little slice of paradise. But as darkness crept in, the woods around them seemed to change. The shadows grew deeper, and the silence became oppressive. As the group sat around the fire, a figure emerged from the trees. He was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light. "Mind if I join you?" the man asked, his voice low and unsettling. Taken aback, Jacob glanced at his friends. Mark gave a hesitant nod, and the stranger sat down beside them, his gaze fixed intently on the fire. The man introduced himself as Earl and spoke with a strange, almost trance-like quality. He shared cryptic tales about the forest, hinting at dark rituals that had taken place long before their time. His words sent chills down their spines, but they chalked it up to the eerie atmosphere and the isolation. Eventually, he stood up, nodded in their direction, and disappeared back into the trees as mysteriously as he had appeared. Unnerved but trying to shake it off, the friends turned in for the night, but their sleep was broken by strange noises, a rhythmic chanting that seemed to echo through the woods. Jacob crawled out of his tent to see shadowy figures moving through the trees, carrying flickering torches. He quickly woke Mark and Sam, whispering about the bizarre ritual unfolding around them. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through Jacob's arm and his vision blurred. He barely registered a prick from something sharp before he collapsed to the ground, his senses numbing. Mark and Sam met a similar fate, each succumbing to a drug-induced haze as they were dragged from the campsite. When Jacob regained consciousness, he found himself in a cold, dimly lit cabin, his hands bound. Mark and Sam lay nearby, still groggy and disoriented. The walls were adorned with strange symbols, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. Fear took hold as they realized they were prisoners of a shadowy cult whose members began chanting once again, eyes glazed in reverence for some dark, unknown entity. Desperate and fueled by adrenaline, Jacob managed to loosen the ropes binding him. He motioned for Mark and Sam to do the same, but time was running out. The cult members were preparing something in a corner of the cabin, muttering ominously. As one cultist stepped forward, a knife gleaming in the firelight, Jacob saw his only chance. With a burst of energy, he tackled the cultist, yelling for his friends to run. The three friends broke free, stumbling into the woods, their hearts pounding as they darted between trees, desperate to escape. They ran through the night, driven by the primal instinct to survive. When they finally reached their truck at the forest's edge, they didn't look back. They drove for hours, not stopping until they were miles from that cursed place. The ordeal left deep scars, both physical and mental. To this day, Jacob refuses to return to any remote campsite. He still dreams of those hollow eyes staring back at him, and he knows he and his friends escaped by the narrowest of margins. For them, the forest holds a darkness that will haunt them forever. Story 3. A Dark Discovery. Hunter's Night Encounter with the Wood's Deadliest Secret. Ethan Blake had always considered himself a seasoned hunter. He'd grown up navigating the dense forests of Louisiana, tracking game by day and night without a second thought. But one evening on a solo hunt for wild boar, he stumbled upon something so sinister that it would shatter his confidence forever. The night was unusually still as Ethan moved through the thick underbrush, his flashlight casting narrow beams through the darkness. He'd been tracking a boar for hours, listening for the faintest rustle, every sense heightened. Just as he was about to give up and return to his truck, he noticed movement in the distance. A figure slowly making its way through the trees. Curious but cautious, Ethan dimmed his flashlight and crept forward, careful not to make a sound. The figure moved with a slow, deliberate pace, dragging something heavy behind him. Ethan squinted, trying to make out what it was. His stomach dropped when he realized the figure was pulling a long, dark bag, one that looked suspiciously like it held a body. Frozen in shock, Ethan watched as the man stopped and bent down, muttering something under his breath. The words were inaudible, but the tone was low and menacing. A chill crept down Ethan's spine. He'd stumbled upon something far darker than any wild animal. He considered turning back, pretending he hadn't seen anything, but a mix of adrenaline and curiosity urged him forward. He adjusted his flashlight, pointing it just enough to illuminate the figure from a distance without giving away his own position. The man was tall, with a gaunt face and hollow eyes that reflected the flashlight's faint glow. When he turned to drag the bag again, Ethan caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. A pair of lifeless eyes peeking out from the unzipped edge of the bag. Ethan's mind raced. Who was this man? And who or what was he dragging through the woods? His instincts screamed for him to run, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. Just as he was about to turn and leave, a twig snapped beneath his foot. The man froze, his head snapping up as he scanned the darkness, eyes narrowing. In a split-second decision, Ethan stepped out of the shadows, flashlight raised. "Hey!" he called out, hoping to intimidate the man. But instead of fleeing or explaining himself, the man just grinned, a twisted, joyless smile that made Ethan's stomach churn. "What are you doing out here, friend?" the stranger drawled, his voice dripping with menace. Ethan steadied himself, heart pounding, and demanded, "What's in the bag?" The stranger's grin widened, and without a word, he dropped the bag, stepping closer to Ethan. Every instinct screamed for him to retreat, but the man's gaze held him in place, his cold, unblinking eyes promising something far worse than any encounter with a wild animal. "You don't want to know," the man whispered, his voice barely a murmur. "But since you're so curious..." He lunged toward Ethan, and in that split second, adrenaline took over. Ethan stumbled back, raising his flashlight as a makeshift weapon. The man's hand grazed him, and Ethan spun around, breaking into a sprint. He didn't dare look back, his only focus on escaping the clutches of the predator lurking behind him. Branches tore at his arms and face as he ran, heart racing with terror, each breath feeling like it could be his last. Finally, he spotted his truck in the distance, relief flooding him as he reached the door, fumbled with his keys and jumped inside. Peeling out of the forest, he didn't stop until he was miles away, the man's twisted grin still etched into his memory. Ethan has never returned to that part of the woods, haunted by the knowledge that some things lurking in the darkness are far more dangerous than any wild animal. He knows he barely escaped with his life, and he's still haunted by the question of who or what was in that body bag. Please like, share, and subscribe